right, excellent. Good morning, everybody. My name is Justin McLaughlin. I will be today's EYEJ Speaks moderator. To those of you who are new, welcome back. Or to those of you who are new, welcome. And for those who joined last week, welcome back. EYEJ Speaks is a virtual community discussion which features engaging and empowering discussions on social justice and civic issues. The topics you see here today are derived from topics discussed in EYEJ's core program for youth, which is the discussion series and online program YODJ. Over the course of the hour, we hope that you will have that you will leave with some tools and you can bring back to your communities and organizations surrounding money. EYEJ Speaks is an interactive forum for the community, and we want you to join in on the discussion. So whether you're watching on Facebook or Zoom, please ask questions, make comments, and use the hashtags EYEJ Speaks and hashtag social justice in the comment section. Also, if you haven't done so already, there's a handful of social channels you can follow EYEJ Cleveland on: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and the handle is just one word, EYEJ Cleveland. So EYEJ Cleveland serves over 1,500 youth. The mission is to empower and amplify the voices of teens and preteens by bridging them with diverse individuals to engage in interactive discussions around social justice. The nonprofit has several signature programs, which include a discussion series, which is a 1-hour discussion series usually held in schools across Northeast Ohio, predominantly in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District for 6th to 12th graders, where volunteers partner with youth to discuss social justice topics such as exploring power and privilege, community relationships, race and justice, and more, with the goal of providing an open and safe environment to have an honest discussion. There's also the Youth Council. The EYEJ Youth Council is a group of youths ages 15 to 25 from all across the districts in Cleveland who work together to brainstorm issues, injustices, and challenges both they and their peers face in the community. A third program is the YODJ, which is Youth Online Discussing Justice. This is a 12-week program that started recently because of the pandemic to ensure youth have a virtual platform to exchange ideas and gain perspective on social justice issues with diverse and empowered community members, peers, and volunteers, and they meet twice a week. And last, before we kind of set up the conversation, there is a current campaign going. It's called the Empower campaign, and thanks to everybody who's donated so far. Very impressive that they've raised almost a little bit over $80,000 already. And that's going to go to support several things, one of which is it'll enable EYEJ to deploy 2 new programs in which tech and online instructional infrastructure, which is needed to deliver learning programs while youth remain sheltered in place. And then also it will help EYEJ Youth Council members and their families to cover some household costs for bills, healthcare, and food. So with that said, if you are able to, would love to have you support our work and ensure we can provide impactful programming. You can text the numbers 44321 along with any amount that you're able to gift. So again, that's 44321, and this is for the Empower campaign. So with kind of that out of the way, wanted to talk today about exploring money. Money can't buy happiness, but certainly it can give you a sense of safety and security. Everyone knows we need money to pay our bills, take care of our families, pay for education. But as essential as money is, it's not often talked about in schools in the United States. You don't necessarily learn things about the value of saving, how to write a check, how to balance a checkbook, when to open a bank account, how to create a budget. So today's conversation is going to look at some of these fundamentals with the goal of empowering you and empowering your families, leaders, and educators to have a meaningful conversation with young people. We want to help you understand your own relationship with money and acquire tools and resources applicable to your own personal life. So, as you can see, we have several speakers that are joining us today. We have Katie Ross, who is the program director or a program director at EYEJ. We have Lawrence Perry, who's an educator and intervention specialist in the East Cleveland schools. And then Michael Mendlovic, joining from Key Bank, where he's a vice president and relationship manager. So the format here essentially is I have kind of about a dozen or so questions that I'll pitch to the panelists, and then certainly, as I mentioned before, would love to have any of you listening kind of hop in and pass along your questions. They'll be passed along to me, and we'll definitely make time for them. So, without kind of further ado, maybe we'll go ahead and kick off. Katie, I'll kind of throw it to you first. Why is having today's conversation important to you about exploring money, and why does EYEJ in general feel so passionate about having this conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Justin, for starting us off. I know you mentioned this in our introduction, but this topic isn't really discussed in schools. And with EYEJ, we start with this conversation as early as 6th grade. I think it's valuable, any student, to have a foundation and a space to talk about this. They may not be getting it at home. They may not have the people in their lives that themselves know how to utilize money and become financially independent. So it's incredibly important to create the space to not only teach them foundations, but have a space to ask those questions. One thing that we really utilize is we go through an actual budget, and we talk about the definitions and the language around money. And we've seen students really be able to utilize that outside of our sessions and apply that to their everyday life.
Right. And Lawrence, I'm curious maybe to get your thoughts on this. How do you kind of approach the conversation with your students about money and money management? And then maybe on top of that, how do you, what are some of the challenges you're seeing right now with youth when trying to discuss money in this topic?
Well, good morning, everybody. The biggest thing is kind of difficult with the different educational mandates, especially in the, not even just across the country, but especially in the state of Ohio. So for example, we talk about financial literacy. There is a small portion of financial literacy in Ohio in the learning standards for social studies, but it's not really pushed. I know through the years they have told American history teachers and government teachers, we need you to teach this, but it hasn't been really pushed to be uniformity and to have it done with fidelity. There's a small portion in there that, as Katie stated, is not talked about a lot. Now, the thing about it with me, what I do is, so for example, I have a set of standards that I have to teach. And so, for example, we talk about communism, I get to talk about capitalism. And I begin to talk about entrepreneurship and things like that. And we start to talk about the free market, ownership. A lot of our students frequent this gas station across the street. And I say, well, that person can own as many gas stations as they want because we live in a capitalistic society. So that's one way. But another thing that I do is I look at the child's behavior financially. What are they buying with their own money? And then I can kind of start the conversation. If I see kids with a lot of candy, chips, a lot of the times, I often stop them in the hallway and say, okay, what you spent for that? Maybe you could have done this. You have to be very creative when you can't just have a whole class as you would like on financial literacy. So I often find different ways in the hallways in the classroom to steer the conversation toward financial literacy and ask different questions and give my own personal experiences. But you have to be very careful because it's difficult because they expect you to teach certain standards to prepare for a test. Another challenge is the history of maybe what the student may or may not have had. Have they been exposed to different spending habits, credit, debit, different things like that? You're challenged with what are they taught at home? And so what I do, I'm very sensitive to that, but I just ask questions and I look at where they are now and I challenge them. And then I try to give them as much education as possible with the very finite time that I do have to teach that, to teach that portion.
Great. Katie, maybe toss it back to you. I know we had another member that was going to join, somebody on a youth council, and she couldn't join us. But one of the questions I had for her was, what are the conversations that that she would have with her friends about money? Maybe who are some of the people they look up to, and what are some of the things that they talk about in their friend group as far as like what does financial success look like to them? So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on maybe what you've heard young people talk about, or you yourself, what you kind of talk about with your friends around money, and what does it mean to be financially successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been a really cool experience speaking with these students on this topic. We talk about exploring money, but we also have topics around investing in your future, achieving a positive mindset, and they're really all interconnected. Lawrence, who's been a volunteer with EYEJ for several weeks now, has been able to be part of these conversations with these students for several weeks now, and we've been able to kind of see how they all connect. And I would love for Lawrence to comment in at all if he would like to. But yes, Ariana was supposed to join us today, and I'm going to speak a little bit about her experiences on behalf of her not being here today. But we have found that students their age aren't necessarily talking about those conversations externally. Ariana is in sixth grade. She's going into seventh grade. And she actually has a nail business. She started doing her nails when I first met her as a student. She texted me one day as we first were, developing our relationship. And she said, I need a business card. I said, a business card for what? And, she said, no, I do nails, $25 a set. And so I said, okay, let me show you how to use Canva, and we can make this. And so it's interesting because I think some of these students are doing things, but they don't have the language and the knowledge to understand the impact that it can have on them long term if they continue these habits and or don't continue them. And so for Ariana, yesterday we talked about investing in your future. And like I said, these conversations are very much connected. And we talked about how you have this idea, you're technically an entrepreneur. How can you invest in your future? What do you have to, investments, expenses that you can think about long-term in your nail business? And these are questions that, she's not being asked. She's not being thought to critically think like that. So I think, like I said, I think the majority of youth have some of these thoughts, but they don't have the language in the space to talk about it and to kind of understand the impact of it. And Lawrence, if you want to add anything, you've been right alongside with me in all of these conversations.
I mean, the biggest thing is that I've learned from just the conversations. For one, Ariana's, to me, just side note, is not to me personally, the average sixth grader going to the seventh grader. I wish she was here that day if you ever talked to her and the way that she's thinking. I think the biggest thing is just exposure and giving these students exposure and answering their questions. Because for me, I've been in education a while, but to hear this young lady, she sounds more mature, but also knowledgeable and yearning for knowledge than some of my high school people. And that's not to, I'm just saying, it was just mind-boggling to talk to her. But just to expose and to basically what we have to do as support is to hear their ideas and kind of point them in the right direction. That's what they need. They some of them know what's in their minds, but to kind of point them in the right direction and get them formal, technical skills and abilities, and even the right people to talk to. For me, I'm not the biggest one on business, but to get them to talk to the right people. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I'm an entrepreneur myself too, and I think you nailed it right there, which is exposure. If you expose yourself and you build that network of kind of people that have been there and done that, that's probably, in my opinion, the single biggest, eye-opening experience to me was just meeting with other entrepreneurs, other people that have done it. So that's really well said. So Michael, good to have you today too. Michael's again from KeyBank, and question for you, Michael: how do you teach young people to have a healthier relationship with money, and maybe especially in some situations where that healthy relationship isn't already visible, whether it be in their home or the surrounding community?
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. So I think that, kind of to go along with what Katie and Lawrence were just saying. So I've done a lot of the speaker series before, and I think I've done Exploring Money probably more than any of them, probably 4 or 5 times or so, and over the last 3 years or whatever it may be. And one of the things that Katie and Lawrence, you guys were just talking about, like, really how do some of these kids see money, and how do they see themselves as entrepreneurs, or what do they think money comes from? I know one of the questions that we ask all the time is when we're sitting in front of the kids is how are you going to get money? And 9 times out of 10 it was they're going to play professional ball, whether it's basketball or football, and so I several times we've kind of broken that down. So let's talk about LeBron, for instance. Clearly he has a lot of money. Where does his money come from? And the kids are always surprised to see that a much larger percentage of his money comes from his business ventures as opposed to his actual salary from playing basketball, how smart he's been with his money over the years. And so I think kind of education and just getting them to understand exactly where money comes from, how it's earned, how it grows, I think that's really the key. We were having a conversation in one of the CMSD schools, I don't know when it was, last year or the year before, and it was 6th graders. And believe it or not, we started talking about stocks. So Lawrence talked a little bit about capitalism earlier and kind of explaining to them again how money grows. And we asked them what your favorite brands were. I think someone said Nike and someone else said Apple. And then we kind of explained to them that you can actually own a piece of Nike or own a piece of Apple. So sure, you can take $150 and you can spend it on a new pair of LeBrons, or you could take that same amount of money and buy a share of Nike stock. And while all of their friends keep buying new shoes and new sneakers, new LeBrons, that just means that share of stock you have that was once worth 1 pair of shoes is now worth 2 pairs of shoes. And we talked very, very high level about kind of how stocks work and how spending a little bit of money up front can yield some pretty big results down the road. Again, these are 6th graders, so it's very, kind of at a small level, but it was really interesting to kind of see the gears in their head start to turn. I think at a much more micro level, I think it's kind of taking money out of money. What I mean by that is really talking about the differences between needs and desires. So going back to the Nike example, I guess, so talking about what else that $150 could have bought, right? What's the purchasing power, the buying power of a pair of shoes, for example. So I think to have a healthy relationship with money, kids really have to have an understanding of what it is, of where it comes from, how they can get it, and how they can get it legally. That was a big part of what we would talk about. What's really interesting about being in the room with these kids is, it's really a conversation. It's not us just sitting there talking to them and explaining to them how the world works. They know how the world works. They live in it. So it's really getting their understanding of how their world really works. And a lot of them express that they want to be able to get money in ways that don't have to do with doing illegal things. That nail thing, the nail business, that's awesome for a 6th grader. That's unbelievable. A lot of the kids that they would go, they'd go to the store and they'd buy, 24-pack of water, and then they'd go and sell the individual, bottles on the streets and whatever that may be, like, to the cars that they're going by, and they'd make a lot of money that way. And it really showed them how they can then take those proceeds and make it into a bigger thing. So it was kind of neat, again, seeing their gears working, but you kind of have to focus them and get them to really understand, to Lawrence's point, how they can do that, even at a young age. Right?
And I'd love to add something to that. I think Michael really nailed it when he said understanding their relationship with money. And, Ariana is definitely a student that stands out to us, but the majority of the students that we serve, the needs versus the wants is incredibly difficult, and it looks a lot different to them than it may look to me. And so it's valuable to keep note that these students are acting out of survival, and so recognizing where their money needs to go to them, it looks a lot different, especially if that's how they've lived their whole life and that's how their role models utilize money for survival, to have enough food on the table. And so I think that value and that component of understanding the needs versus wants, and what long-term wealth can look like and how they can start building that and breaking those cycles is incredibly valuable.
Great. Yeah, and I think you just kind of touched on my next question a little bit too, as far as like mentorship and role models. And maybe Lawrence, you have anything to add here, but can you just talk about in your opinion, what you've seen maybe that's successful as it pertains to mentorship or personal development for very, very young people, getting set up for success early on, either financial or professional success, and kind of how you've seen mentorship and role models play a factor in that.
Well, I believe it's everything. And let me say this, I still need direction now. And I'm pretty sure Michael, if I had some financial questions, he could probably tell me stuff I don't know now. And that's serious. You need direction, exposure, education, everything. A lot of my mistakes were based on ignorance, lack of knowledge. I accrued a lot of financial debt in terms of just because I didn't know. And I was just kind of spinning my wheels and doing things. So it is extremely important. And I think the best thing to do is to don't assume that they already know, but to approach everybody sensitively that they don't know and give them the information that they need. But I think we talked about it before is how they see money. I think it's extremely important not to just talk to them and talk at them, but how do they see money? And then you connect with them by saying, okay, I'm taking your foundation and now we're going to work on where you can go to be successful. Financial independence. For example, real quickly, I often ask young adults, we know what their interests are, not all of them. They love, a lot of the young adults that I interact with love cars. I say, okay, one day you're going to want a certain type of car. How do you think you're going to be able to get that car? And we talk about it. And I said, you know what, unless you're just rich, you're going to probably have to go into a dealership. You probably have to have some, what they said. And I said, you're going to have some credit problems. You got to talk down payment. So we get to talk about that stuff. And some of them do, and some of them don't know. So it's the fact of steering them it's so important because many struggle for lack of knowledge. I do. I didn't know a lot of things. I just bought a home recently, but it's some things I had to learn prior to. I bought a home last year. I had to learn prior to that, even that as an adult that I didn't know. So if I'm an adult and I don't know, what are some of them either exposed to or not exposed to? Are they exposed to predatory lending? Different. You understand? You know that there's a lot of in our neighborhoods. Let's just be honest. There's a lot of check cashing. Let's just be honest with each other. I'm from East Cleveland, Ohio, where I teach.
Yeah.
So they have to have direction. And guess what? If I don't know, I'll go ask somebody who will know to help the students out.
Are there any books or any kind of groups? Obviously EYEJ is one of them, but are there any other organizations or books that you might recommend? Even podcasts. I mean, listen, I went to school for accounting. I'm my own entrepreneur. I give financial advice to people, but I'm still reading and I'm still learning every day about new things. So I think to your point, it's not even just about learning as a kid. It's like a lifelong pursuit of knowledge when it comes to money and managing your money. But I'm curious, bringing it back down to the youth. Is there any kind of resources that you've got?
Dave Ramsey. I listen to Dave Ramsey now. I mean, everybody now some people don't agree with him, but he has stuff for students. He has things for students geared toward young people. I listen to his podcast, I get the notifications from YouTube, and so I choose what I listen to, what I don't, but it's a lot of information. So I do know he has stuff on his site for students that they can access. That's one of the things off top that I can think of right now.
That's great. I'm curious, either Michael
there's
or
a
Katie.
lot of, I was just going to say, Dave Ramsey has a lot of material out there. Almost every bank does too. So if you, so there's, Lawrence mentioned check cashing places. That's a pretty big problem in minority communities. And for those of you that don't really understand the difference or what that means, essentially, if you need a small loan, let's say you need, $1,000 and you walk into a normal bank, I'm talking like large banks. The interest on something like that, I don't know, off the top of my head, you're talking probably 8, 9, 10, 11, 12%, something like that. It's high, but it's not insane. Check cashing places are usually around 20, 30, 40%. They used to be even higher. They used to be over 100% sometimes, but there's regulations that have cut that down over the last few years. And so one of the issues is that there's not enough real banks, if you will, in minority communities, because it's just easier to kind of pop up a little check cashing place. So many banks have really, over the last decade or so, made a really big push into those communities. And a lot of times they offer those kinds of materials. And it's really just kind of banking 101, savings 101, things like that. So whether, whatever bank it is, I happen to work for KeyBank, but whatever bank you work or you bank with, you can just walk in and really ask them for information to share with kids. And they'll usually have it.
That's great. Back to you, Katie. Let's maybe talk a second about generational wealth. What is it, and how do we empower young people to develop that kind of mindset about creating, sustainable wealth for the next generation, especially within their family?
Yeah, I think Michael kind of talked a little bit about this, to access to money and access to banks. And so I think when it comes to generational wealth, and I'm not exactly sure if this statistic's exactly right, but I think it takes something like 3 generations for a family to change generational gaps, whether that's low, middle, or high income. And it's much easier for middle class to drop down to lower and vice versa versus middle class going to upper. And so that comes down to, what are these opportunities that families are having to gain wealth, and not money that is for survival, not money that goes away in X amount of days and they're just cutting their bills. And so, a big part of empowering young people is to develop a mindset of entrepreneurship, developing a mindset of being creative, and how they can create wealth and not just short-term wealth. And I think it's important to acknowledge that race has definitely played a role in generational wealth. I mean, when we talk about redlining and banks being able to provide or not provide loans based on race, I mean, that's still impacting communities and families today. Because of course, families that weren't able to get loans 50, 60, 70 years ago made it more difficult for them to gain wealth. And so that's going to impact their children and their grandchildren that are currently living today. So I think it's important to still note that generational wealth is impacted by laws that used to exist, and that it makes it difficult even today for students, and especially the students that we serve, to think about wealth in a way in which can break those cycles and can start gaining that wealth and sustainability over time.
That's great. Just a reminder to anybody that's listening in, certainly, I don't believe we've gotten any questions yet, but you can certainly submit your questions, whether it be via Zoom or Facebook, and definitely try to get to them in the next 20 or so minutes before we wrap up. So this is next question for Michael. Conversations about money come up. We often hear terms like good debt and bad debt. Can you describe the difference between the two, and then maybe, in your opinion, the right way to use that?
Sure, yeah, and I'm going to add on real quick to the question that Katie was just answering about generational wealth.
Sure.
So it's so I work for the Key Private Bank, and my entire job essentially is managing generational wealth. So it's making sure that folks and families that have been fortunate enough to have a whole lot of money can pass that along to the next generation. And I often tell people that I work with that well, we're going to have a very good relationship. It's really the next generation, and so your kids and grandkids that are really going to appreciate the things that we do. So it's difficult for people who are second, third, fourth generation, or even to Katie's point, it's difficult for people who grew up middle class, who are now upper class, to hang on to family wealth over the course of 1, 2, 3 generations. So imagine how hard it is for somebody coming from lower class who has somehow made it to hang on to that as well. I mean, you don't have to look any further than just looking at, countless stories of athletes who have, not even within one generation, but within a career, have blown most of their money. So it's there's a conversation that has to happen, and something that we do with a lot of our larger families is really sit down and talk to the next generation without talking about how much money they have. But we really want them to understand what it means to kind of carry on the legacy of that family, right? So if it's, the McLaughlin family, what does that mean to be a McLaughlin? What does that actually entail? And that's from philanthropy and how they live their life and how they spend their money. So it's an interesting conversation that we have. And again, it's difficult enough just to have that with people who are used to having money. It is an entirely different situation with people who it is brand new to them. And a lot of that goes to your next question, which is kind of good debt and bad debt, and what does that actually mean? I think we've all mentioned this over the course of this talk so far, kind of the needs and desires. And that's kind of what good debt and bad debt is. So essentially, good debt is debt that you're going to use to purchase something that's a need. Oftentimes it's something that's going to appreciate in value. It's going to go up in value. Not always, but usually. So a mortgage is a good example of that. If you use a mortgage to buy a home, that's good debt. More often than not always, but more often than not, the value of that home is going to go up over the course of your ownership of it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. A car loan, if you need a car to get to work and you have to take on debt to get that car is not going to be worth more than when you bought it. It's going to be worth less, but that's still good debt because that's something that's going to help you get to your job and kind of move on in life. Student loans within reason are generally considered good debt. Education, unlike a home, a car, really anything else that you purchase, education is the absolute only thing that I can think of that once you have can never be taken away from you. Literally ever. You have it for life. That's generally good debt, depending on how you use it. Bad debt would be credit card bills. So, if you need to rack up a little bit of debt to buy groceries, okay, that's fine. But if you're racking up that debt because you spent the money that you should have spent on groceries on something that was a want and not a need, then that would be bad debt. When you use credit cards to purchase things that are simply a want, then the value of that thing goes down. That's bad debt. Not to mention, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but bad debt is much more expensive. In other words, you're going to be charged a lot more to use that money than good debt. You're talking 5, 10, 15 times the amount sometimes.
Got it. To follow up on that, here's a scary statistic from LendingTree. Among the class of 2019, about 70% of college students took on student loans, and they graduated with an average debt of about $30,000. Both federal and private loans. With so many people incurring college debt, what are some of the financial tools they need to be aware of? Maybe now, especially talking about very young people, so they can kind of get ahead of that and kind of minimize that amount of loans they have to take, or kind of be aware so they're not leaving school with really, high levels of debt. I know a lot of teachers, for example, that are 5-10 years into their career and they're still paying down, student loans, and it's a significant portion of the teacher's salary, as you can imagine. So, I guess the question then, what are some of the tools you suggest, and then how can holding on to a significant amount of college debt potentially impact you well into adulthood?
Yeah, so I just mentioned how student loans are good debt, and I still think that's true.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand kind of the ROI, the return on the investment. So what is that degree going to get you? I think that's really a crucial question. So if you're graduating college with $30,000 in debt, the degree that you got, which allows you to get the job that you're going to get, better give you an opportunity to earn enough money to pay back that $30,000 in a reasonable amount of time, and that payback isn't going to hurt you and take away from the other needs that you have. I think there's a few ways around this. I think there's a whole nother, we could talk for 5 hours just about maybe regulations and things that maybe need to happen on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
But for what we can do today in our lives, you mentioned private and federal loans. So I think trying to stick to federal loans as much as possible. They tend to be a little bit lower interest rates. They're more forgivable as well. So depending on your situation and the career path you take, you mentioned teachers. So oftentimes there are some loans that will be a little bit forgivable if you teach in under marginalized communities. There's certain ways that you can go about getting kind of better loans. Another really good way, and we see this a lot, instead of enrolling in a 4-year college right away, take classes at a community college like Tri-C here in Cleveland. You do that for a couple of years. It's significantly less expensive. You then transfer to a 4-year college to earn your degree and finish up graduation. Nobody knows the difference. Your diploma looks exactly the same as everyone else's. You just have less debt, which is always nice. You asked a little bit about how holding on to that debt throughout adulthood can impact people. I think a lot. So there's something called the time value of money. So essentially, $1 today, intelligently invested, I guess you would have to say, but $1 today should be worth more tomorrow if you do the right things with it. So let's say you owe $30,000. That's going to take you 15, 20 years to pay back, depending on the program you're with. You're paying $300, $400, $500 a month on that. If having that extra, let's call it $300 a month laying around, causes you to have to use a credit card to pay for the needs, not the wants, but the needs, then you're actually paying interest on that $300 twice. You're paying it because you took it out for student loans, and now you're paying it again because you have to borrow more of that, and you've been at a higher interest rate as well. So I think that the less amount of debt, and this goes for not just student loan debt, but debt in general, can really impact your future more than I think people really understand or realize.
That's good. To one of those points too, I did exactly what you did. You said when I was going through college, I was going to a private college. This is many years ago, but it was something like $500 a credit hour back then at my school. And then I grew up and lived around Northeast Ohio, so in the summers I would take a few classes at Tri-C, and aside from the fact that it was a lot less expensive, it was also an incredible high quality education. And to your point, Michael, I know maybe some people care about the name on their degree and where it's coming from, and you're exactly right. Like, it's not like on my degree there's a little asterisk that says, oh, you took classes at the community college. And I am a huge fan of recommending that to young people, especially if they're the ones that are on the hook for paying for college. I know there's a lot of schools within Ohio that partner up with community colleges, so you can do your first 2 years at a school like LCCC or Tri-C, and then transfer up to a Cleveland State or even a Case or a Baldwin Wallace or John Carroll, and kind of finish out, and you save yourself a tremendous amount of money. And I think it's a pretty it's a great way to kind of reduce the amount of student loan debt you might be walking away with.
CMSD actually has a program where I think while in school you can take classes and they'll pay for it.
That's
so you don't even have to pay for that 2-year college, and you're doing it as a junior and senior, I believe. So it's huge. And then on the flip side of that, so that's having your kind of your high school pay for your college, and then taking the smart loans in college. On the flip side of that, once you graduate. And this goes to what Lawrence was saying earlier. Sometimes we just don't have the right mentors and the right people to kind of guide us and put us in the right direction. But there's a lot of jobs that you can get that'll maybe pay back your student loans. Like I went back to graduate school to get my MBA, and my employer paid for that entirely. So there's ways there's forgiveness, not just from the government for going into certain jobs, but sometimes if you go into the private sector, those actual corporations will pay all of their student loans off.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing with some of my friends that have gone into consulting, where, to your point, you go and get your MBA, and then you kind of agree to stay on with your employer for a couple of years. But I mean, talk about a huge benefit getting that advanced MBA, and then also having an employer pay for it. That is a very, very, very wise decision. So I think we got a couple questions coming in, which is awesome. For you, Lawrence, any specific books that you recommend by Dave Ramsey, or I'm less familiar with him, but does he have a podcast that you listen to? Anything you kind of recommend? One of the members asked.
I know he has, if you go on YouTube and put in Dave Ramsey, he has a podcast that you can listen to.
Okay.
If you if you Google Dave Ramsey, also he has a site with a plethora of things. I wouldn't do it justice to name exactly what it is. But more for me, I listen to him as opposed to reading. But if you go to that site, there's like so many different things that you can actually, look upon. But if you YouTube it, it's free information.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Where he has a ton of stuff. But if you want more specific information, if you want it for students, if you Google Dave Ramsey, he has a whole site, and he has a lot of different, people that work for Dave Ramsey Solutions. And if you navigate the site, there are different things if you want specifics. That's just who I kind of swear by. And like Michael said, the banks, like we've had banks coming to school before, different things like that. But that's kind of the person that I kind of like swear by, so to speak.
Got it. Another one of the questions, and I maybe just kind of open this up if anybody has any thoughts or feels comfortable talking about it. I personally really don't have any insider thoughts into this, but I think it's Caitlin White who says it could be beneficial to discuss financial desperation or lack of financial opportunities for marginalized individuals who are more likely to be recruited into sex trafficking situations, or certainly we could kind of, explore things like prostitution or just, drugs and making money illegally. Be curious if anyone has any kind of thoughts just around that topic in general, discussing the financial desperation and lack of financial opportunities. I hope that some of the stuff we've talked about today can kind of point people in the right direction, but don't want to be ignorant to trying to have, you guys share any thoughts, Lawrence, Katie, Michael, anything on that?
I think that in regards to financial opportunities for marginalized individuals, I think the reality is there's still, oppression that individuals face in job discrimination, that individuals face in marginalized communities. I think we have to recognize that to be able to move forward from it. Of course, that's part of what the entire movement, just one part of the entire movement of Black Lives Matter, that's happening right now. And so I think we have to understand that there's still lack of opportunity. There are still students and there's still marginalized communities, especially the students that we serve, that aren't going to have equal opportunity. And so when we talk to students about that, we can't beat around the bush in the sense, that is something that they know themselves, whether they've had been discriminated personally or seen their parents be discriminated, or maybe they haven't had the conversation, but it exists. And so I think we still need to be talking about that. I mean, exploring money and having all these opportunities to gain knowledge and create space is great. It's awesome, but it still comes down to the fact that when these students go into the world, they're going to face discrimination, it's unfortunate. And for marginalized individuals that may be pressured into other areas such as gang recruitment, because that's the way they can make money. Like Michael said earlier about how do we talk to these students about gaining wealth in a legal and safe way. And so that's a whole nother battle, and it still needs to be talked about now because it's truth. And I think when it comes back to survival, Ariana stands out to us. She, for being sixth grade and being an entrepreneur, it's great. But then we ask her, okay, so where does your money go? How are you investing it in your future? How are you thinking about, generational wealth? And she's like, oh, well, the majority of my money goes to my mom because she needs it. Helps with rent, helps with my little brother. So that's, this is why the cycle of discrimination and the cycle of oppression in regards to wealth is still a problem, so yeah, she's on the right path, yeah, she's thinking in the right way, but then her money has to go to her mom. So it's something to consider, and it's something that has to still be addressed. I appreciate Caitlin for bringing it up. Yep. I think it's the reality of what the majority of our students face every day.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing. It's funny, because I can take back to my own story. When I was in high school, certainly not sixth grade, but in high school, started my first entrepreneurial endeavor, which was, a landscaping company. And me and a couple of my closest friends, we got together. We bought, a big commercial lawnmower and kind of put flyers in everyone's mailboxes. And I wish Ariana was here. I'm really interested to meet her, because I think that's something that, listen, even if, this nail business is just a temporary thing, like my landscaping company was a temporary thing for a few years. And even if the money she's making right now, goes to support her family, and mine probably, didn't get invested well. I think that the skills that she's learning, the things that she's learning right now as an entrepreneur, are probably going to follow her for the rest of her life. And certainly the nail business could start booming and turn into a big thing, and she could franchise it. But even if not, I'm really excited for her, and her getting into something like that at such a young age. One of the other questions from Rosalind, she says, I have 6 nieces and nephews. They range from 2 to 20 years old. And what can I do at home to serve as a mentor to them? I'm not a financial expert, but I do want to be a good example to them in any way that I can. Does anyone on the panel have any suggestions about what Rosalind can do?
I was going to say something. I think Mike could probably answer that a little, bit better right there.
Well, I mean, I think there's things that we all can do when around kids dealing with money. So, I think one of the important things is if you're shopping with kids, it's making them understand kind of the value of things. And 2 to 20 is a pretty big range. So that upper half of that range, you can really explain it with money. That lower half of the range, sometimes, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but taking the money out of money. So it's about the value of things. So if they really want, Lauren spoke earlier about candy and chips and things like that. So if a bag of candy is $1, what else could you do with that $1? Or if you really want the big bag of chips and that costs $1.50, and all you have is $1, it's about explaining, well, maybe if you just wait a week, you'll have more, or a couple of days, and you'll have more, and you'll be able to buy that. So I think it's less about, what the value of the actual dollar that you're holding is, and more about setting the good example of really how it is related to other things. Everything's relative in the world. Or even if you're shopping, let's take food out of it, you're at the store and you see a shirt that you really want, and really talking through your reasoning for maybe not buying something or buying something with the kids that are around you. I really like this shirt. I'm going to start saving a little bit of my money so that maybe in a month or two, I can buy this without having to I can buy this want without having to take away from my needs. Or the other way around. I've been saving, so now I have the money that I can actually purchase this for. I think it's less about talking and more about just showing and setting that good example.
And you want to go for it, Lawrence?
Well, real quickly, I think that's a good question, but I think it's just like Michael said, it's about action first. You know what I mean? Yeah, you're going to have dialogue, but enter them into your financial life if you can. And if you're going to the grocery store, take them with you. Take them with you and show them, I have a list. This is what I'm going to spend. And this is the type of products that I buy. So they can visually see what she's doing. And and a lot of times in education, you get a lot of people say, we want the kids to be hands-on. We want hands-on. So you want to give them the hands-on training, but also, what you have to do is be honest with them about money. Maybe some of your mistakes that you made, to just really tell them, but also show them. One example that I give, I have a nephew who's 9, and my sister started giving him an allowance. My mother, that's her only grandchild, so she spoils him. But what she did is put a whole plan together for my 9-year-old nephew. I looked at it. She's retired, so she has time on her hands. She put a whole plan together of things that he needs to do. It's a calendar and what the money he can make per week. I saw it. I'm like, wow. So this past Sunday, she came to my home and she bought him an electronic piggy bank, to where he puts his own code in, and there's he can put, when he gets money, he can just put it up there and it takes the money. So we're starting him off. That's something as simple as, hey, if you do this, if you do this by the end of the week, I'll give you this. But then you have a piggy bank and you can put your money. So we starting at 9 with the concept of saving money. That's something so practical that most people can do. It doesn't take financial expertise, because I'm not that. It just telling them the practical truth that what you know about money. That's what I would say.
And I think just to add to that, when we talk about this topic with our students, we go through an entire budget. So we together did income, expenses, what are your needs? So what are your monthly payments that aren't going to change? What are the payments that will change? And so we talked them through it. We inputted it all. We did the math together. And in the past, when we've done this with students and we've given them these budgets, they've gone home and been able to sit down with their parents and do things like this and come back to us and said, hey, look, this month I've saved this amount of money, and like now I understand how am I spending and why every time I make money from my job at the library, it seems that at the end of the month I don't have as much money because now I see where it's going. So I mean, we've been doing this topic for several years, and it's been incredible to see the students actually come back to us with these testimonies around how talking and having the language, and like both Michael and Lawrence alluded to, really going through a budget with a student can benefit them long term.
Yeah, it's amazing when we talk to them about budgeting, and I'm glad you brought that up, Katie. The relative cost of things was completely foreign to them. So you go through the exercise. We were saying, how much is rent or mortgage? Okay, then how much do you think your family spends on food a month? How much? And while 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, they understand the concept of money, they have no idea, for the most part, especially the folks that we're talking to, how they relate to each other. So how much is going towards that? How much is going towards food? And so, budgeting is huge. And a lot of times they don't have those expenses at that age. So especially, again, you're talking 2 to 20, right? So that's a big age range. But especially for the younger kids, kind of in that middle group, just really talking to them about the budget that you do, and so that they understand where all of that money goes. Because a lot of times I think kids, especially younger ones, just assume money comes from wherever, and mom and dad and aunt and uncle, grandma, grandpa, we just kind of spend it, and then things just show up. And so I think it's really breaking down where, either on a pie chart, which is very nice and visual, as to which percentage of the money is going to where. I think that really kind of opens their eyes a little bit to it.
Thank you. So that's pretty much it for the this EYEJ Speaks for today. We have just a few minutes for closing. Kind of maybe let each one of you, if you want to kind of hop in and spend a minute just kind of on closing remarks, and maybe anything you hope people take away from today's discussion. So maybe to you first, Katie, and then we'll go to Michael and Lawrence if you guys want to kind of wrap this up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I think 2 things. One, it's exposure, like Lawrence said. But I think what ties into exposure is exposure and opportunity for marginalized students.
Yep,
That
yep.
was a whole lot different than exposure and opportunity for the rest of the population. So how can we strategically implement these aspects of exploring money to a population that is disadvantaged and lacks trust in the system of creating wealth?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think building up trust is so important. I think it was Katie. I think you mentioned redlining earlier, and while that hasn't been an official practice, obviously, for many years, 50, 60, 70 years, it is something that carries on even to today. No doubt about it, it has definitely created communities that are marginalized. It has created a more difficult situation for people that if they didn't have those problems, if their great-great-grandparents didn't have those issues, they would not be in the situation they're in. So I think that money lending institutions and banks have made a lot of progress over the past 20 years, let's say, to move into those marginalized communities and try to bridge that gap. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to happen. But, I work for several large institutions and I've seen what they're doing. And it makes me hopeful for the future. Again, a long way to go still. But really, it's building that bridge and making people understand that that there needs to be a trust there between the two groups.
I would just say education, because and we can't. And I don't think we're not being cliche. We understand that we have an issue. Nobody's hiding that. Generational poverty is extremely real. We talked about generational wealth. Generational poverty is extremely systemic and it's real. And sometimes people will perpetuate what they've been around. I would say to make it simple, and let me say this real quickly. David Ramsey is not the only person you can listen to. That's for me. That's my opinion. There's so many other people can listen to and find out about. Let me say that. I don't want to think that that's the only person. But one of the things I learned from him is money is mostly about behavior also. So if I say I want to help our communities out and I say I'm going to give this money, if you're bad with $5, you're going to be bad with $5 million, so to speak. So behavior is everything. And I want to say this. I would want one day to have a massive financial literacy curriculum, massive, not what the little they have now, because somebody could say, well, they have those standards in the state of Ohio. No, I'm talking about massive, where it is loud, where it is uniform across this whole state, especially in urban communities, but for everybody, so we can at least expose them to what, even if they don't think they need the class, this is what we're going to do. And that's what I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, this was a great conversation, and certainly kind of one of the things that drew me into EYEJ was, my passion is entrepreneurship and starting companies too. So for anybody that's interested, I'm certainly available to connect and kind of share my stories and how I got started in it. I'm kind of what you would call like a bootstrap entrepreneur, which means I basically started with nothing, started from zero, and I built a company, 20 people, and it's spread throughout the country. So it can be done. And like to everyone's points here, like it's a lot about exposure, it's a lot about networking, it's a lot about education. It's a long road, but it's a very fulfilling journey. So I'd be happy to kind of speak with anybody that might be listening that's interested in at least hearing from my side of point of view. So it's been a pleasure to host this week's episode. If you want to hear more about exploring money, please be sure to follow the conversation on EYEJ social media platforms. Thanks to More, and the EYEJ team for all their work. There's several people that were part of this initiative, like Tara, Andre, Anna, Pia, Kenyatta. And, if you like today's program or you're familiar with some of our other initiatives, such as the YODJ, please be sure to support the Empower campaign. You can do that again by texting 44321, along with the amount that you're able to gift. Your contributions will ensure we can give a voice to over 1,500 youth annually, in addition to supporting families of youth, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. So just a reminder, next week at 10 a.m., we'll reconvene and talk about civil rights. and you'll have another great new diverse panel and hopefully another great conversation. So thanks everybody, Michael, Katie, Lawrence, I appreciate it. And again, thanks everybody that helped organize this.